I'm going to make a start and welcome you to this BioPhorum Insights webinar on standardizing traceability of personalized cells and gene therapies. And our intriguing subtitle is that tracing cells for personalized cell or gene therapy needs to be even better than Mumbai's famous lunchbox delivery system. You'll have to wait to find out what that's all about in just a minute. But what I want to do is to really introduce to you the 8 speakers we have, not 6. Sorry if you're only expecting 6, but don't worry, they'll be short, each of them. And we start with Becky talking about the context and the current situation and really trying to get to how important is traceability. And then Juan is going to tell us about the basic process that we are tracing, but albeit with many different therapies implemented slightly differently. And then Elena will look at the user stories. What do people need the IT solutions to do for them to make that process smooth and effective, regardless of therapy type? Then Kim's looking at benefits. How does this connect to things our executives know are important, the business objectives of our organizations? Why are we wanting to put effort and resources into traceability? And then Fred will look at traceability as a set of services. This is starting to think about how we build traceability solutions. And modeling them as services means we can think about it together, even though our specific implementations are very different. And that's the foundation for partnering to deliver advanced therapies together, because the industry is full of partnerships. And then we want to think about traceability with Judith's help as a set of identifiers. You may have heard the term chain of identity, but which identifiers are there and how should we use each of those? And then the traceability service definition is going one step further. If we're going to build services, what does that look like? And why is that useful? And then the final segment is, as we work together across organizations, that means having common data interfaces or APIs, by which we mean application programming interfaces for this webinar, not active pharmaceutical ingredients. So these guys are going to take a few minutes each to describe some of what they've been working on together for several months, piecing together what they've learned from their own implementations and their different pieces of work into something that we believe is a common way of describing this. And these guys are all practitioners. So without too much further ado, I want to invite Becky to tell us a little bit about the context, personas, and the current situation. Let's go ahead, Becky.
Afternoon, everyone. So yeah, I'm Becky Street Howard. I'm the Systems Director for Cell and Gene Therapy at GlaxoSmithKline. So over the last year or so, we've been looking at how do we really integrate traceability into our digital ecosystem. We've presented that in an IND to the FDA and EMA and had positive feedback. So we've built all of that recommendations into this BioPhorum paper. So whilst GSK might not be moving forward with cell and gene therapy in the future, we hope that you guys can learn from and build from our experience. So that's a bit about who I am and what I've been doing over the last year. But what I wanted to go through with you guys is really what's the context of this. Starting with the most important thing is, why is it critical? So not to put it too fine a point on it, it is critical to patient safety. And as this rather stark story shows, it can be a matter of life and death. So very sadly, Irmgard Cooper died as a result of confusion over a spelling error on the label for blood supplies in terms of, was this product really safe and meant for her? So this is a situation that none of us ever want to find ourselves in or be the cause of. And it's why we have to pay so much attention to the design of chain of custody and chain of identity, and how do we really make it as error-proof and safe for everybody in the chain, so that these errors are never propagated, they're never missed, and in fact they just can't be made in the first place. So I think here what is key is that it's seen as a critical quality attribute. Additionally, it's not really something you can test into the product. So a bit like sterility assurance, this is something where the checks and balances and the kind of robustness of our process has to stand on its own 2 feet such that no errors are made. So a rather sobering start. But what we wanted to kind of challenge ourselves was recognizing how important this is, but also how complex it is. We wanted to look at where could we learn from others, so who else is delivering in a complex environment with multiple handoffs, needing to work very fast and also at scale. So David can do the big reveal, and this is how we come on to the lunchboxes of Mumbai. So this is something I hadn't heard of before I started in this group. A very clever person, I can't remember who it was, so I can't credit them, but came up with this fantastic analogy. So to give a bit of background on this, every day across Mumbai, upwards of 200,000 tiffin boxes are delivered from home kitchens to offices. So these boxes have to be sorted, transported, delivered and returned all within the same day with minimal or no errors, or you don't build the trust in the system. So I think they're credited with an error rate of about 1 in 16 million deliveries has an error, which equates to about 1 every 2 months over a kind of large scale. So we wanted to look at what have they done and how could we learn from it. And I think the key message that came out is the simplicity. So they use color codes and numbering, and it's very simple system so that lots of different people can follow it without error. Having said that, in cell and gene therapy, we need to be better than this. So we need to be able to absolutely demonstrate full traceability. But as we go through the kind of next hour and a half, we really want to make sure that everybody keeps in mind and keeps coming back to, is this as simple as it can possibly be? And part of the reason for that is just the number of people who are involved in traceability across the supply chain. So I won't go through all these different personas or people who have to be working with chain of custody, chain of identity, but for illustration, I'll just talk about 2. So if I start with the apheresis nurse, so this is somebody who on the day that they're collecting the patient's cells are dealing with the patient at an emotional time. It can be very difficult going in, getting your cells collected. So they first and foremost have to be managing that patient's experience through the hospital. At the same time, though, they must also be entering and transferring all of the data, and they will need to be doing this in a number of different systems. So they'll have the hospital system recording all the patient data, and possibly documents as well. They'll have the labelling and the printing to make sure that they've got all the right labels for the various bags that they'll be creating. They'll have to be entering data into the sponsors system, whether this is commercial or clinical. And we've had a lot of feedback from clinicals and commercial hospitals that they get portal fatigue in terms of each sponsor has their own portal, and they have to remember or be trained in all of these. They may also be dealing with the courier systems as well. So huge complexity and equally high importance that they get all of these data transfers right. As well as this, they're under time pressure. So as soon as those bags have been collected from the patients, they are under time pressure to get them into cold storage to make sure that they keep the viability of the product and the quality of the product as high as possible. So while chain of custody, chain of identity is key to them, it's not the only thing that they are doing. So how do we really help and support them to not make any errors and to make it as easy as possible? Similarly, and I could, as I say, I could tell a story about each of the characters on the screen here, but if we look at the manufacturing operator as a second example, and specifically I want to zoom in on when they're labeling the bags. So you could imagine the labelling obviously comes at the end of the manufacturing process. Often if you're on a 2-shift scene, this could be the end of a late shift. If you've had issues, you could be going into overtime at this point. And this is the point when we're asking the operators often to manually transcribe or write 13-digit identifiers into computer systems, making sure that they've printed the labels correctly, put them on the bags correctly, reconciled all the labels, had all the data second checked. So just at a point where we've got someone who is potentially, not always, but certainly the situation can arise where they're potentially tired after a very long shift. They're needing to do a number of different operations, including this quite complex and very detailed focus-orientated task. And additionally, again, because of the nature of the cells, they are likely to be under time pressure to get this into the freezer or the cold store within, for example, 90 minutes. So just by me describing that, I'm describing a classic situation where people can make mistakes. So as we're designing this chain of custody, chain of identity, we have to be helping all of the people in that supply chain to not make errors. It's an unfair burden to be putting on them, and the implications and the impact would be to the patients. So with that, I'm going to hand you back to David and the rest of the team to give you some practical and really pragmatic ways of how we can achieve this.
Well, thanks, Becky. So for the next segment, it's Juan. And Becky was talking about the complexity, and it's especially complex if everyone's process is slightly different. So here's Juan's story about why it's so important to have a common process across different therapies and different organizations.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Juan Jaime. I've been with Johnson & Johnson for 18 years. I'm part of our Janssen supply chain organization. And I'll talk a little bit about the end-to-end process. So in terms of my role with Janssen, I've been leading the technology team pretty much from the ground up, building our end-to-end global supply chain, both internal and with our external collaborations, which we'll talk a little bit about. And really that end-to-end traceability to launch our very first product. So those of you who are familiar, Janssen is in commercial state with our first CAR-T product, which is CARVYKTI. So we'll talk a little bit about, what the end-to-end journey looks like. So what this view represents is essentially a set of actor organizations, and it illustrates really the complex ecosystem of these typical types of partnerships that are needed in order for us to deliver a personalized therapy. So the process and the data integration are really key topics here that must occur across these different companies. Now, keep in mind that each of these companies generally has their own set of existing systems. So we really need to connect the dots between them to enable what we call the end-to-end product journey. So the key actors here are the treatment centers. These are your healthcare providers across the different regions and hospital networks. Then the other ones is your shipping partners. These are usually the individuals responsible for managing the logistics to bring the personalized medicine to and from the patients. The third one is the sponsor or the market authorization. So in our case, this is us, Janssen, where essentially the sponsor needs to have some type of a control tower or a method in which they are able to track orders and really orchestrate all of the key activities, including managing all of the exceptions that may happen across the end-to-end product journey. And then the third one is your manufacturing. So in a typical ecosystem, this may be in some cases in-house manufacturing facility, or it could be a CMO, a contract manufacturing organization, or you may have a mix of the two. And then your third piece of the puzzle here is your quality control. Generally with quality, you may have some internal, but then some external quality across the different pieces of the puzzle that you need to cut across. If we go to the next section, David. So we'll just take a zoom in a little bit more into each of these topics. So in terms of the treatment centers or the collection center here, what you see is the key activities that happen. Essentially, this is the front end piece of the puzzle that is responsible for your patient enrollment, your scheduling, doing some of the early steps like in autologous therapy, executing your cell collection and cryopreservation, and essentially handing off then to your shipping partner. Your shipping partner is responsible for taking care of the product while it's in transit and making sure that you're maintaining everything in quality specs. So measuring things like temperature, tilt, location, etc. Once you get into your manufacturing space, so this shipping partner will deliver to your manufacturing, whether it's internal or external. Once it's there, they essentially take care of all of the core magic. So making the actual product, labeling the product, and then again, freezing and being able to get the product ready for shipping back. Now, keep in mind through all of these pieces, really important is that traceability end to end as you're cutting across organization to organization. Once your product is ready to ship back, there's some signaling that happens between the treatment center and the manufacturing organization. So you essentially go through your quality release and ship in parallel to the activities at the manufacturing. You're seeing the activities happening at the treatment center, which is essentially preparing the patient. In some cases, you need to perform activities like leukodepletion or bridging therapy. So there's a couple of different activities that the care team has to take care of. So it's really close coordination and timing with what is happening in manufacturing. Again, your shipping partner plays a key role in making sure the product is delivered in time when the care team is indicating that they need it. Once the care team receives the product, then they do they administer, and then you begin the follow-up and into long-term care. Okay, so this is kind of a high-level end-to-end view of how we orchestrate across the different organizations. And again, bearing in mind some of the complexities and challenges here is how do we connect the dots across different systems that belong to different organizations. Okay, let me turn that back over to you, David.
And Juan, maybe you could come on video again, because just thinking about that's what we put together from everybody's perspective. But you've actually done this, haven't you? So you think back and retrospectively just look at what you've done and what you're working on. Just what comes to mind as sort of key lessons that you've learned, perhaps. I know I didn't prepare you for this, but we'll try it anyway.
No problem, David. So I think what I said there at the end of the video was the key thing, right? Solving for when you orchestrate, how do you connect the dots? You know, I think in a lot of our traditional pharma products, it's usually internal, or when it's with a contract manufacturer, it's a true black box. You know, we hand things to them or they hand things to us and that's it, right? A lot of the stuff we own internally end to end. So here it's how do you orchestrate and connect the dots across systems that belong to multiple organizations to create a single unified patient experience.
And hence the need to describe the process in terms that isn't specific to any of the systems, but will work with whoever you're partnering with, whichever systems they've got.
Yeah. And as we work with different partners, we can see that the dynamics from one partner to another can be drastically different. So navigating through those complexities and relationships is really critical.
Let me draw Sanjay into the call. He's put his hand up. Do show your face if you're able to, Sanjay, and then say what you'd like to say.
Yeah, so my question is, the complexity is clear. It shows up on this flow chart, but how do you handle it today? Do you assign a project manager to a single patient who will kind of do the expediting activity for that patient across multiple organizations?
No, so I can't speak to how some of the other organizations that are represented here have set up their model. I mentioned we have a front-end care team, right? It's not a project management team, it's a care team that manages the experience at the hospital. They are heavily dependent on how we have designed and architected our model end to end. So every patient is critical here, but we have to architect and design for large scale, right? So to be able to treat a large number of patients, so it's got to be a highly controlled, repeatable model.
Got it. Understood.
And those visibility functions in the central box there are important. I think on the personas chart, there was this row, can I point to it? This one here, where there was a coordinator, but they're not just coordinating one project, they're coordinating lots. Good. Okay, well, we've got the idea now that you can contribute to this. So thank you very much for joining us and doing that. Others, you can do that as well. What I want to do is now just to think back to those people that Becky had been talking about that are showing on screen now, and invite Elena to tell us about the user stories from the perspective of each of those users of the systems. What do they need the systems to do for them to support the process that Juan has been outlining? So let's hear from Elena.
Thank you, David, and hello and welcome everyone. My name is Elena Rivkin, and I led the business analysis activities for CGT orchestration program at Roche. So at the onset of our journey to collect requirements and design the orchestration system, we were aware of several players in the end-to-end supply chain, so including several CMOs, potential treatment centers, and candidate shipping partners, as well as internal teams. And we quickly realized that not only there are more players in the CGT supply chain compared to traditional modalities, and as you have seen before, that but also that each player in the supply chain have multiple partners, and that these partnerships would only expand in the future. So treatment centers would administer products for multiple sponsors. Sponsors can have multiple CMOs. They would deliver products across the globe, probably utilizing multiple shipping partners. So this kind of complexity or multiple relationships was a very critical consideration for our design strategy. And we knew that in order to be future-proof, we had to rigorously test every decision against future product developments. And this approach also led us to some key design decisions, which you will learn about today, such as modularity, service architecture. So there were several sources from which we drew our requirements. This included existing industry guidelines from FDA and European regulatory bodies, which were specific to ATMP and provided essential regulatory guidance. Our experience with biologics was very important and provided some very important reference points. Also because, as it was mentioned, we were not starting from green fields. It was important to understand the existing architectural landscape and work with internal teams. However, the most crucial aspect of requirements gathering was actually holding feedback sessions with multiple players and keeping all those players involved throughout our design journeys. So we've held feedback sessions with several treatment centers in several countries, several CMOs, candidate shipping partners, and many quality experts. Next, please. So in the publication, we organized traceability requirements in two ways. The first way we organize them is what we call persona-centric. So this is from a view of a specific persona. And this view is very useful when discussing, we're having this feedback session and discussing the requirements with a particular partner. The second view is service-centric. And this is important when designing a module, a service, or discussing the requirements with development teams. Next, please. So in the publication, but also in our work, we use the user story format, which is an industry standard at this point. It's simple but flexible, and it can be used to both describe high-level and very detailed levels of requirements. A typical user story comprises of a role, an action, and an intent. So as a role, for example, a healthcare professional, I want to do something so that I can achieve a particular benefit. And then each user stories will then expand it with multiple acceptance criteria, which provide additional content. And its success criteria and are very important when actually building when actually developing on the requirements and for testing purposes as well. Next, please. So a few examples shown here, many more are in the publication. So this user story is written from a persona who's, we call it end-to-end quality accountable, and basically discusses that this persona wants to robustly link every item shipped to product identifiers. And then the reason for that is that the correct batch is taken and will be delivered to the correct treatment location. And then multiple acceptance criteria actually provide more content on what that actually means in practice. Go ahead, David. Yeah, in this example, if I remember correctly, this is an example where we would write something from a service perspective. So as an end-to-end quality accountable, as same persona, I want to associate the patient badge to the patient ID while it is being processed in the manufacturing site, so that the chain of identity, custody are maintained. So this is the format we use throughout the publication. Thank you.
Good. So within that massive things I wanted to give you is a link to where to get those 60 user stories. And they're all on our resources page, which is linked on the slide, but I've just pasted it into the chat as well. Our most recent publication, that traceability publication, that's where the most recent user stories are. But you'll also see a broader set of user stories from our April 2022 publication, which describes more about the personas generally for the whole of IT for cell and gene therapy. And in fact, there's 5 publications altogether that are all freely available for you on that site. So I hope you find that useful for your own analysis. But I do want to ask you another question, see if we can get some answers coming through on the chat. Here it is now. What do you think is the primary business driver for traceability? Why would we invest in a technical solution to do this? Now, some of you said you are a technical solution provider, so you're saying, why would our customers want to invest in a technical solution for this? Some of you are CDMOs. Why do you need it to be in place? And some of you are sponsor organizations, market license holders. Why? What's the big business driver around traceability? And let's see if we can get a couple of answers coming through before I get Kim to give a segment on some of the thinking here. It'd be interesting to see if some of those answers match up. We have to do this for a benefit. Becky, go on, answer, speak to us.
Yeah, so to my mind, it comes back to being part of the license to operate. So it's such complex but such quality critical attribute. So if you think about what you would invest in developing a QC test method, or the systems that you put in to manage your test methods, this is the equivalent to that, or around your sterility assurance, so environmental monitoring systems. It's got that level of importance, and if you don't, it's part of the regulatory requirement. So as I say, it's part of quality, part of your license to operate, and it's critical to the patient. So that's the justification.
And that echoes Sanjay's comment, life is at stake. That's why traceability is needed. Okay, so it's just fundamental, isn't it? And then the question we're asking is, why should we try and do it in a common way? What's the benefit of that? And I think that's the main thrust of what Kim will describe in her segment coming up next. And then we'll have a chat with Kim after that.
Okay, so I'm Kim Wilson. I'm a business consultant for the life sciences industry for Dassault Systems. My background focus is biopharma and med tech. I'm an engineer and I've worked in manufacturing in the past. And we are helping companies with the discovery phase into clinical trials, into tech transfer with the lab, into manufacturing. So I've been part of this team for 2 years, and it's been enriching to learn from everyone that's a part of it. And hopefully this document, when it's published, will be useful for folks. So let's go to the first slide. I'm going to be talking about a figure, and we're going to build that as we go on. And it's going to show how the benefits accumulate as the solution used for chain of custody and chain of identity becomes fully automated and reliable, and then as it becomes standardized. These business improvements will support biomanufacturing organizations' strategic objectives in terms of quality, speed, flexibility, and cost, and will improve patient lives. So by logging all of the chain of custody events digitally, end to end, the data will be more consistent and less likely to have errors that can occur with manual transcription. The goal is to have chain of custody and chain of identity information controlled, tracked, and error-proof, and that's going to improve quality. If you have a fully automated and reliable solution where everything is centrally logged, you're going to eliminate missing data points. I'm coming along the bottom here first. You're going to reduce the need for lengthy investigations and the time to investigate. Now I'm going to go back up one to the gray box above. So you're looking at all of these people, the release managers, the auditors, and the treatment center reviewers. They want to see this trail of custody events because they want to confirm that everything's intact. And then they're going to be able to check that. And then they're going to be able to confidently release the information knowing that risk to the patient is minimized. And then we're going to come down one to the time taken to check the release is minimized and it's consistent. And then you're going to shorten delivery times for individualized therapies. And we're going to get closer to release or review by exception. And as you can see, we're going to improve quality and we're going to improve speed in this section. Okay, so now if we have an industry standard for logging chain of custody events, we're going to be able to facilitate easier integration with new partners, resulting in less time to figure out what other systems are needed or if they're going to need to be built. These standards are going to facilitate the creation of a unified treatment center portal covering therapies from multiple manufacturers. And once the treatment centers can reduce the number of different portals for advanced therapies, there's going to be a reduction in portal fatigue for healthcare workers. That was something that Becky mentioned at the very beginning. And a reduced risk of human error will result. So we're going to see increased speed here, increased flexibility, and lower cost. With standardized data, modeling the entire supply process in a more consistent and holistic way is one of the benefits. And that's going to open up possibilities for virtual twins, looking at new optimization opportunities. And David asked me to pause here because I'm a big fan of virtual twins. I talk about it a lot, and we talk about the plant, the process, the product, and the patient. And twins have transformed numerous industries over the years. The common ones that most people are familiar with would be automotive and aerospace, but there's also CPG and mining, and life sciences has started to adopt twins as well. And this is an area that hasn't really been explored thoroughly for cell and gene therapy. So this is something that we could explore. And David and I did a podcast on this in the fall. So if you're interested in learning more, you can check the BioPhorum website for that podcast. Okay, so the benefits of a patient data and personalized labeling solution that is compliant with country-specific data requirements and other regulations that allow for product label printing, including patient details using a common hardware and software for printing and scanning is really important. We've got to make sure that the patient details on the final bag that goes to the treatment centers is accurate so that the treatment center and the patient have confidence that the product that is identified is absolutely the product meant for them. And that will improve quality over time. And the last slide, this is the entire figure, which will be in the document that's printed. So as you can see, the orange is where the key benefits are, and the green is the strategic objectives that a company can benefit by. So I will toss it back to David and the team.
And thanks, Kim. You're here on the call as you listen to yourself talking about the benefits. What resonated with you this time as the big one?
You know, it's all about the patient and making sure that everyone delivers the right product at the right time for that patient so that they have an opportunity to survive. And everybody that's been involved on this team and folks that are in this industry understand that. I think everyone takes that to heart. It's all about digitally minimizing errors, improving quality, speed, and lowering cost along the way. And that's what I saw.
Yeah, cool. Now, James Campbell, maybe you could come off mute and show your face as well. And you have an interesting question about ownership, which I'm going to let you speak to first, and then I'll ask perhaps some of the biomanufacturers, perhaps Juan and Becky, you've got experience there, and others to, maybe Fred, to respond. So James, are you able to speak out your question?
Yeah, thanks, David. Yeah, my question from the chat was really around the, I guess you could say the traction within the marketplace, right? So anyone that works in the industry knows that, you know, the overwhelming majority of these cell and gene therapy companies, especially in the clinical stages, obviously are managing / handling, chain of identity, chain of custody, the end-to-end process on spreadsheets and over email, phone calls. They're not using, systems the way industry is for QMS systems or CRM or, LIMS systems, for example. So, it was an interesting point brought up before about just the quality, the efficacy, and the delays and the impacts of the business. So in your experience, who owns this subject or this topic within these organizations, and how does it get more attention and priority? Is it quality? Is it supply chain? Is it clinical operations? Is it regulatory? Because I'm not seeing a standard there across the industry. I'm seeing different stakeholders. So I'm just curious what the subject matter experts on this call, what your thoughts are on that, because it's been an interesting conversation.
You guys know the drill. Come off mute and then you can speak. Otherwise, I'll pick on you. Go ahead, Becky.
So the reason I wasn't coming off mute is I think it's an excellent question, and I think in large part that was a driver for us writing this paper about standardization, because it's not clear. I think the regulations have started to outline it. I think there was some FDA guidance that clarified it last year, but it still needs all of us to come together and define exactly what you're asking, because the answer of everybody just isn't satisfactory and it's not good enough. So, if I could answer from a kind of audit perspective, if I had an inspector in front of me, well, who owns it and who has the custody at any point, I could tell you. And that is the paper and the emails, but exactly as you describe, how it translates through everybody's, all the different organisations, all the different individuals, can be a bit messy, and that's why we need to kind of take this piece forward and drive it into industry, into regulations, to clarify exactly your question, because you could give a number of different answers. As you say, everybody does, and we need it to be standard and clear.
Yeah, I think I appreciate that response, and I think that we all saw this back in the I guess early 2000s, I guess you could say now, with the e-pedigree laws in traditional drug and the commercial supply chains, which eventually led to the DSCSA being passed by Congress in, I think it was 2010. So it almost seems like we're at that sort of infancy, but also the opportunities there to do something similar in the cell and gene therapy world as well, where governments or regulators step in to say, this is no longer a nice to have. We really need to have this, because the thought of a patient receiving, the wrong therapy or being delayed, 2 or 3 weeks, for example, is just terrifying and unacceptable. So as an industry, I don't know how we, go about collaborating and getting to that same point in cell and gene therapy as we were with in traditional biopharma and pharmaceutical.
Good. Juan, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, so similar to what Becky was saying, I think overall, the industry in this space is at its infancy, so there's still a lot of maturity that needs to happen. I think Becky was spot on that regulatory requirements in the space are also still evolving, so that's a little bit of a wild card there. I think we know that the topic of chain of identity, chain of custody is a regulatory requirement. You're right that a lot of the players, especially those who are still in the clinical trial space, are largely running on paper. I think one of the challenges here is in terms of digital capabilities to be more unified as an industry. There were a couple early players as SaaS providers in this space. They haven't really matured or been able to keep up to where the demand needed them to be. So therefore, I think the majority of the players who have gotten to commercial space, to commercial state, have gone with their own internal capabilities or solutions. I will say, at least for my company at Janssen, our architecture mantra is sort of, we prefer to always buy commodities and be at an industry standard or be at industry best practices. When we can't, we build unicorns. We've had to go that route in this space, but we know that there is a desire. I think these types of forums are super important because I think that connect and that desire throughout the different sponsors and different players that you can see is there, right? I think the maturity still needs to happen.
We do need that maturity to emerge, don't we? But just picking up that issue, we're building unicorns, I think you called them. We're building individual solutions for our organizations. And if they all come out really different, that makes them really hard to integrate. Well, that's one of the reasons I think. Fred's going to say a bit about why we should, if we are building stuff, build it as a set of services. So let's hear from Fred.
Hi, my name is Fred Darby. I work at Roche as the enterprise architect for cell and gene therapy, and I'm based out of Switzerland. While I'm a chemist by education, I spent my career in various IT positions in management and architecture over the past 25 years in the life science and healthcare industries. For almost 3 years now, I'm excited. So let's explore now why designing traceability as a set of services is essential for organizations to stay competitive and rapidly in the rapidly changing landscape of cell and gene therapies. We are going to see that with the flexibility and modularity that this approach brings, a standardized service-based approach would allow organizations to better integrate and collaborate. We've seen that was very important, but also to respond to security and compliance needs. David was mentioning GDPR, and above all, to better support the patient journey. If you want to go to the next slide, David, please. Juan already described the process flow model we developed with the BioPhorum for traceability in CGT. And as an architect, I need to understand how we can model the IT solutions that will support these process steps. Our approach is to avoid modeling it as a monolith, but to define services that will interact together. This is this set of services that I just mentioned earlier. And in our publication, you'll see that we represent those services using those black boxes that you have on this slide. And we proposed a list of services or a set of services that being combined could cover the end-to-end value stream or product journey that Juan mentioned as well. And as you can see, some are core to the process, some are external to it, but all are connected. Now, if we zoom in on one particular example, here you can see that the Treatment Center Advanced Therapy Portal service allows a particular process. Here, the process is enroll a patient for a therapy for a particular persona, a clinician. This service will call external services like the patient data service to set up the patient's personal details, but also the COC, COI service to create a new COI ID. In this context, you understand that there are at least 3 separate services in play to achieve this particular process. And let me tell you, this is not theoretical. We are building our CGT solution at Roche using this service-based approach, and we already tested its quality attribute like interchangeability. We have an example of where we had to move our patient data service from one vendor to another, as it was not supporting the FHIR standard. And this approach allowed us to do this switch without having a big impact on the rest of the solution. To move to the
Let me just ask you a question from Dave King. Is this a portal, and is there online information about this portal?
No, that's not a portal as such. I mean, this is the yes, this is a portal. In fact, this is the way of the service that will allow the interactions between the treatment centers and the therapy providers. In fact, yeah. So therapy provider will provide therapies, and those will be made available through this treatment center advanced therapy portal, where the clinician can order a therapy or schedule the different activities that are required for the treatment itself.
Yeah, and Tura, I see you want to jump in probably to tell us about the portal example that you have in your area. Is that right?
What I was going to say is the portal that we're using is commercially available on the market. You can buy it if you want to, and it fulfills the characteristics that I think have been expressed by other presenters on this call, which is to say that it's a multi-tenant environment, can be used by anybody, and it's a single point of entry for the treatment center and the healthcare professional. So no need to build your own. It's one of our core principles at Bosch.
So what we know is that there are lots of portals, and what we've tried to do is to model all of them in this form so that there could be that kind of interoperability. Carry on, Fred.
So thank you, David, and Tours. And that's I mean, typically what we see. I mean, the way we technically realize a service might be different from one organization to another. And as Tours was mentioning, it can be 3 different portals coming from 3 different vendors. And we've seen it's been done in different ways. It can be a custom treatment management platform, like the one we do use at Roche, or a vein-to-vein solution, or an MES platform, or whatsoever. I mean, it can be coming from different solutions. But what we would like is the structure of the data to be the same regardless of how we implement it. This is crucial in order to be able to speak the same language, and this is where standardization is key. The APIs have to be standardized. And I want to mention another benefit of the set of services approach with the simplification of deployment. We have a concrete example at Roche with the need to deploy our solution in a country with very strong legal restriction, forcing patient data to be stored in country. In this case, you do not want to clone or replicate the entire solution in this country. What the service-based approach allows is to only deploy locally the services that are required by law to be run in this particular country. It will then speed up the deployment, reduce the cost, and simplify the overall landscape. Want to move to the next slide, David, please? This is just an overview of how the services may come together to constitute the overall solution. Next slide. So, why are we modeling it as a set of services? here are 7 points to answer this question. So when multiple organizations are involved in the process, each with their own unique implementation, it can create confusions and inefficiencies when trying to coordinate efforts and ensure continuity across the entire process. But by breaking down specific processes into discrete services and creating those common APIs that I mentioned, it becomes easier to identify commonalities across implementation and develop a seamless collaboration between organizations. This approach allows for faster and more efficient collaboration, leading to faster development time and ultimately better service. Integrate new partners without disrupting the rest of their infrastructures. In addition, the use of the common APIs ensure that partners can seamlessly integrate their therapies into the existing system. This approach also provides the flexibility to select the most appropriate partner if the landscape evolves and if the need comes later, without disrupting the entire system. Another benefit of modeling is that it allows organizations to comply with the local laws and the regulation for the data security and privacy. As I mentioned earlier, by having control over the storage and management of their data, organizations can ensure that sensitive information is protected and complies with local regulation, including those specific cases that I mentioned where there is a specific need to store the patient data in country. And furthermore, building systems that are modular and scalable allows new types of therapies and data sources to be incorporated into the system more easily. It enables organizations to adapt to changing requirements and technology without developing silo monoliths. It also allows for greater flexibility in the way the data is managed, analyzed, and making it easier to identify trends, patterns, in all the analytics that can be developed around that. And lastly, the scalability built into modeling as a set of services ensure that the system remains efficient and can handle the growing demands of the organizations. And by having this scalability built in, it can avoid costs and complexity of having to replace systems as the needs change over time. You can just adjust and adapt only parts of the complete solution. And now a call to action. Such an approach using a set of services and standard APIs requires an involvement at the industry level. So please join us in developing and shaping this required industry standard. Thanks. David?
And so it partly answers Vishal's question, does the BioPhorum team work on COI/COC standards these days? How would you answer that, Fred?
Sure, we would like to, for sure. We want to, and there is a specific piece of work that is done around that. And this is not only the COI/COC. I mean, we need all those services to be very well described, and the interactions between those services also clearly described and standardized.
And just from a BioPhorum point of view to say, we're not a standards development organization, but we do want to create the collaborative agreements that could be the basis of future standards, probably working with SDOs to do that. So thank you, and let's get a little bit of conversation going. Go ahead, Robert.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. When you think about the portal fatigue that was mentioned earlier with multiple systems being used, I think it would benefit everyone participating in this therapy supply chain to decouple the portal functionality and the data infrastructure needed to share the data across different players.
So let's just pick up this point first and get a response from Fred. What do you think about decoupling?
Yeah, I think that's typically what we are trying to achieve in going in this service direction versus the monolith approach, where yes, data is just part of this big beast where you cannot handle it, And having those service breakdown with the in the definition of services as well, the data attached to the service. Data has to be attached to the service, as well as configuration needs to be attached to the service. Then you can decouple in this sense, or allows a different interactivity and follow-up of this across the chain. This is typically what it would allow.
I think that what we're trying to achieve is a more standardized approach, not only to the services, which I totally agree with, but also being able to give freedom to different hospitals, apheresis centers, manufacturing companies, logistics, the ability to do their thing, but still be part of the overall solution, right? So we need to have a compromise, right, across everyone.
Yeah, and we've been in contact with many of those treatment centers. One of the things they said is that they don't want to have 10 different portals to connect with, and I mean the same number of identities and so on and so on. So having this multi-tenant approach and service base is can help with that as well, simplifying also the interactions from their side.
Thank you for just bringing that to life with those comments there. We've modeled traceability as a set of services, but as the other way of thinking about traceability is as a set of identifiers, the clues in the chain of identity. There must be identifiers in there. And Judith, you want to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about the wonderful diagrams we produced in this area.
So hi everybody, my name is Judith and I am Principal Consultant for Cell and Gene Therapy at BioPhorum Software. So I'm working together with our cell and gene therapy customers on the implementation of an MES system as part of a digital ecosystem. And I'm also leading our partnerships with COI, COC providers and others. So obviously, I'm having a lot of discussions about traceability, especially in autologous manufacturing, but also in allogeneic. Of course, we are really talking about the necessity for donor traceability. So what Fred already described perfectly is that we usually see different services coming together over the journey of a patient from collection to the treatment. And I would like now to take the next step and see which different identifiers are generated by these different services, but also which of these identifiers need to be passed on over different services and basically can be combined to cover the complete traceability of a patient's journey. So thank you. So if we think about the very start, we already see that the healthcare management system usually provides a patient ID together with a donation ID. And of course, these are unique for this particular healthcare management system, but not necessarily globally unique. And if we take the next step, we see that we usually have the patient data service that we have already discussed, where a new patient ID is usually generated. And this patient ID is usually the one that the providers or the sponsors can really take on because they are working closely together with the patient data services. So this patient ID can now be used in order to ensure uniqueness within the manufacturing system. And the general approach that we have taken, as we see here in the very beginning of the journey, was to say, well, we have specific requirements, like we always need 2 identifiers to ensure that we have a backup system and that we always will follow all the different guidelines that are required. But also, as David already mentioned, we need to acknowledge patient safety. We need to acknowledge that the source system patient ID by the healthcare management system usually contains specific information about the patient, so it can only be used by services that are HIPAA or GDPR compliant. And of course, this is not the case for the complete journey if we think about MES or labeling systems. So if you go to the next slide, please. The next step of the process, in our opinion, would be that we now have to marry the patient with the treatment information. So in this treatment center advanced therapy portal, which we also already discussed, we can now take over the different identifiers that we have already generated coming from different systems and now only pass on the few that are really required, because as Becky said in the beginning, it's all about doing it as simple as possible, because this will lead to less errors and this will lead to the best approach because it's the simplest, and with that we can cover basically the complete traceability with the IDs, with only these IDs that are really required in this moment. So after we have married, so can you go back, please? Thank you. So after we have married the patient with the treatment, we now often see as basically the preparation of the actual manufacturing, a chain of custody, a chain of identity service. So here we will only take the ones that we really need, like patient ID and treatment ID, for example, and create the COI ID. And for COI ID, we had in mind the new guidelines from ICCBBI that had just been released a few months ago, which will really make sure that this COI ID is globally unique. And with that, of course, provides a huge advantage over the patient ID and others that we have used before. And also the COI ID is combined in a way that it's really not anymore related to the patient's name or any other sensitive information. So this gives us now the possibility to pass on the information to the next systems without needing HIPAA compliant or GDPR compliant systems when it comes to the manufacturing part. So the next step is now, for example, the manufacturing order management. And here we are making sure that we marry the COI ID, which is, again, if we follow the ICCBBA standard, globally unique identifier. And together with that, we will now, of course, generate the order information like order ID, batch ID, whatever we need in order to continue with the manufacturing part. And by using COI ID in the combination with one order-related identifier, for example, the manufacturing order or batch ID, we have now two identifiers, not HIPAA compliant or no requirement for HIPAA compliance, that we can follow now over the complete manufacturing process. And if you go now to the next slide, here we see how all of these things come together. So what I have just described is with the top left corner, and as we see, there are way more identifiers and way more services involved, which are also required. So if we think about the QC laboratory, for example, if we have the batch ID together with a unique sample ID that is generated by a good sample management system, then we don't even need the COI ID anymore. So we really reduce it to the absolute minimum of identifiers that we would need. That doesn't mean that we can't also pass on the additional identifiers, but we were really thinking about how can we make it easy as possible. And I will not go into the details here. I think we have, as I said, we have put a lot of thoughts in this whole structure, and a lot of details about that can be found in the publication. But just on high level, basically what happens now is, of course, we have the manufacturing process, the DP is generated, and then we would pass it on again over the chain of identity, chain of custody service, remarry it to the initial patient information or to new patient information in order to trace now the last part of it until we reach the treatment center again. Now, again, we make it as easy as possible, but still we see that it's a lot of services and a lot of identifiers. And we have seen in our discussions that it's not one service, one software. Of course not. There are a lot of softwares that cover different services, maybe just one, maybe two or three, and also the different softwares are a little bit different. But it's still clear that there are a lot of passing points. And the more we can automate here and the more we can pass this information on automatically and the more standardization we have here, the better it will be. And we really think that this is the huge necessity right now in the industry to make sure that we can cover all of these approaches without extending effort. And that's where the APIs come in place. And I think David and Jan will now talk about that. So I will hand over back to you, David.
Well, thanks. And I wonder, Judith, if you could come and show your face, but also perhaps Raja and Rita and Owen, who are on the call and have all made comments in the chat, which might be relevant here. And let's just see if we can get a short amount of conversation going. Owen, you're from a standards organization. Do you want to just tell us briefly about that and your perspective on these identifiers?
Hi, yeah, thanks. Well, I'm the executive director of ICBA. That's the ICCBBA. Of course, that's the organization behind the ISPT 128 standard. Very happy to hear it included here in the discussion. And of course, the chain of identity identifier. We released a standard for that in December last year to standardize the format so that it could more easily be shared across systems, for instance. We're hearing from developers that it's already part of their release, or it's planned for release in their systems later this year because users are looking for it. So that is very satisfying for us to hear that it seems to be getting good uptake. And what's important to mention, I think, is where did it come from? Where did the standard come from? And it emerged actually originally from the industry working group in the United States, which to some extent is something similar, I think, to BioPhorum and other similar groups. And it came out of the realization that we're doing the same thing different ways, and that's creating headaches. That idea then went to the standards coordination body, the SCB, and ICBA took on much of the work. It went then through different consultations, including a public consultation. It was further adapted and, as I said, released. And what's in progress now is an implementation guide. And if my colleague Karen Monitz was here, she would say it would be great to have feedback from developers or end users on that, including lessons learned that could be passed on to the community.
So let's just make that something that we could try and take on if you can involve our group in that sort of feedback process, as we did when there was that new standard for the COI ID. We gave some feedback comments in. This is a really good function for this group to do. I do just want to read out the comment that Raja made earlier. We need to understand labeling standards in Europe, similar to ISPT 128 standards in the US. Does that resonate as a question or a comment?
Could I pick up on it?
Yeah, that's why I ask you. Yeah, go.
Oh, you're right. Sorry. So, well, the US, I mean, the standard is location agnostic. So it happens to be widely implemented in the US, but what we've seen is, I would say, in large thanks to accreditation bodies, FACT, JC largely in Europe. It's becoming a feature, a fact of life in what are traditionally bone marrow transplant programs, but increasingly they are the delivery site for cell and gene therapies. And they are, if you like, using technologies and hardware, software that will carry these systems without the need for further systems. So it goes back to what many of your speakers have said, which is the challenge for those professionals. They're under tremendous pressure time-wise, and they have better things to do than learn another system. So anything that can be done to exploit existing setups will be most grateful.
I want to get Rita in just before we run out of time on this one. But Rita, there's a question about serialization. Just would you ask your question, see if we can get a brief answer?
So my knowledge of serialization is quite limited, but a lot of it is about track and trace and being able to trace products out in the market to prevent falsified products. So for me, there's a lot of the same ideas of being able to trace things, and there's been a huge serialization effort. So are there learnings to be taken from their good practices or errors that should be avoided when moving and having a bigger scope in cell and gene therapy? It's an open question. I don't have answers.
I think from my perspective, for example, with the new SBT 128 guideline, we are already going in this direction because the idea is pretty much the same, to make sure that we have globally unique identifiers. And if we think about one batch per patient, I think it kind of already resonates. I think from software development perspective, I can say that we were able to leverage a lot of software functionalities to make sure that we can really provide that. I think one thing that comes to mind is really an allogeneic approach, where it comes to donors who donate again and again. And of course, this information needs to be stored as well. So I think that is something where we can definitely refer to serialization in general. And I think when it comes to learnings, probably the most obvious one, but very important, is we really need a global standard, especially in serialization. We have seen that different countries come up with their own standard and needing additional requirements. And that is always adding to the effort that everybody has to do in order to follow the global standard if they want to deliver to different countries. So I really hope that we will have that as a lessons learned from serialization and go in this direction with cell and gene therapy. That would be my view.
Well, thank you for that concise response. I need to make sure that we hear all the segments today, so I'm going to ask David to tell us a bit about what it means as a service provider to deal with these service definitions.
So hello, everyone. My name is David Gray. I work for Emerson Automation Solutions. I manage the solution architect group for Emerson globally, and our responsibility is to ensure that our customers, which are typically manufacturers, we meet all the requirements through our software implementation. So the existing of a service, a pre-existing, especially standardized service, makes, I think, everyone's life a little easier. Mainly because a significant portion of the work's already done. With an industry like this, everyone gets together and agrees on what, I say the 80-20 rule, right? What we're defining meets 80% of the requirements. In this case, probably even more than that. And equally importantly is it provides that terminology and that vocabulary with which to have your conversations among the different vendors and the customers. So that standardized vocabulary saves you all time on the front end of, what do you really mean by this term? That data structure that exists along with those services helps identify those gaps, and it really moves the conversation from, a blank page saying, what would you like, to why won't this existing service definition work for you? And that drastically changes the conversation in that development process. And then you start to talk about the differences on that standard as opposed to a blank page. And that's very beneficial for everyone involved, and greatly reduces the time of requirements definition and development. So we talked about in this organization 3 services, and to move forward, we're only going to talk about this one in the context of this user stories, so that chain of custody service. So starting at the beginning of the process, that apheresis nurse, when they collect that sample, would collect that information from the patient, and that would then call that service, that pre-existing service, to create that new chain of custody identifier, put into that system. So again, that service gets called and she passes in that patient-specific information to start this process. Once that's in and labeled, obviously, the receipt or dispatch person who would then, all right, I've handed this information off. So part of that service captures, all right, this person, who did what all the way through the process. So that dispatcher would then say, all right, I have to make sure I hand this off to the right person, and then work with the courier to say, all right, I've handed off this specimen to the courier, which would then again call the service to say, all right, let's track that log into that central repository that Kim referred to, right? As you progress through the standardization model, moving from disparate systems to that centrally logged environment, it would then create that additional element for that courier to say, all right, now it's in the possession of the courier. So once the courier delivers to the manufacturer, that then creates another transaction with that chain of custody to say, all right, it's a new item, it's now in the hands of the manufacturer, and the manufacturing person can then verify that, hey, this is the right person that I need to manufacture this material for in this process. On the back end of that, as that product is labeled, it's that those cells have been manipulated, and you now have that final product, which will then get re-administered into the patient. The manufacturer would then create that new chain of custody ID to say, now I have these final products to go back and then hand that off back to the courier, again, creating that entry into the log for that handoff. These common services in the portal, the centralized portal that we refer to, really makes that end-to-end quality accountable person, makes their job a lot easier. Whether they're going into that common portal or can pull the data from different systems using these services, makes their job a lot easier. So they can then release that product to say, I've checked everything along the way, and I can confirm through these logs and reports, or hopefully the systems themselves, that this information and this patient is actually receiving the right information and all the information is accurate. That also allows the nurse to say, all right, now I have my final product. I can then be sure that I am administering this product into the correct patient. And then lastly, throughout this entire process, the person or group responsible for that end-to-end delivery can look through and proactively identify through dashboards or reports or what have you, that everything is progressing as required, because that standardized set knows the availability of those services to identify those bottlenecks and proactively address any potential issues. So those are kind of how those services will be used within those user stories. I'll pass it off to John to discuss the APIs.
Well, thank you, David. And it's just neat to see how that technical detail connects to a very human element, as you've described it there. So thank you for that. And now, Jonathan, application programming interfaces is not whatever the other acronym stands for in your industry. So introduce yourself and tell us why this is important to you.
Yes. Good morning. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm John Butterfield. I work for Lonza. A majority of my past is within cell and gene therapy manufacturing. However, for the last few years, I've worked with manufacturing execution systems, implementing electronic batch records for us. I now work as a senior business analyst with Lonza, working to apply Lonza's digital strategy and deliver MES systems to many of Lonza's business units at all of Lonza's sites, or at least a large amount of them. Similar to other products, cell and gene therapy products, specifically autologous products, require the sharing of information between multiple organizations, both internally and externally. One key difference is not only the amount of data, but the urgency that some of this data is required in multiple systems simultaneously. A standard API, as David referred to, is an application programming interface. This is a well-known tool that enables applications to communicate with each other. It's a set of rules. These boundaries between systems are often required in near real time to allow our vein-to-vein process to be successfully executed. Vein-to-vein being the portion that Rebecca and Juan had mentioned earlier in the presentation. BioPhorum's vision defines a maturity model for the sharing of information between organizations. The urgency of this data may drive the level of integration that's required. Information may simply be shared in a weekly phone call, for instance, or maybe paper batch records that are shared to clients or other departments. This is typically how maybe early clinical information might be shared. It might be shared by a team running a report from one of your systems, and maybe that system either automatically is sent to a client, or maybe it's manually, again, maybe emailed or something to your clients. What's important is that these methods aren't really sustainable for an autologous product that patients are waiting for. Some of the information is required in real time for success. So that we can strive to not only maximize our commercial throughput, but to make sure that we're meeting those quick release criteria while ensuring patient safety. At Lonza, we're always working to achieve the highest level of automation for our processes in order to ensure those maximum efficiencies are gained. This requires communication and agreement with our clients as well as our other organizations. Near real-time data transfer is likely not the solution for all of your data, although it is absolutely pivotal for some elements, such as your traceability elements, like we're talking about for chain of identity and chain of custody. In order to ensure our clients, as well as our own internal departments, have information that they require for a lean process, we must first understand the type and quantity of the data that's required. Example of the real-time data points, specifically around traceability, have been talked about during this presentation. Some of those are chain of identity, maybe order information, donor information, shipment information. There's lots of data points that were kind of mentioned or you'll see within the paper as you read through it. Chain of identity, for example, it's a very simple data point, just an alphanumeric data point, but it's extremely critical data point that's generated at the start of the process for an autologous product, and it must be ensured throughout the entire vein-to-vein process. So from collection, delivery, receipt, manufacturing, shipment, all the way to infusion of the patient. This one data point has to be shared between many different systems in real time so that it can be verified and confirmed prior to performing any step within the process. Understanding that process and the required data is just the first step. This paper is focusing on what that traceability data is and the identifiers that are required for these APIs. The next aspect of integration is to ensure that we work with all of our organizations to understand what the data structure is. So after we understand what the data is, we must understand where's the data coming from? Where does it need to go? That's part of your data structure. Another important key aspect is when does that data need to be shared? Is it something that is real time? Or is it something that you just need by the end of the process for your certificate of analysis to be generated, for instance? At Lonza, we spend a lot of time with our clients understanding what this data is and kind of agreeing to when does it need to be transferred. And that's where creating the standard API can really help all of us so that we can not necessarily eliminate those conversations, but kind of reduce them and have a standard to point to help us. As Kim mentioned earlier, it can help reduce the effort required in implementing an API for multiple products. You can reduce your validation efforts, protect your organization, aid in your development experience, and importantly for our businesses, lower costs that are needed for creating these standard APIs. After the data structure is understood, that's when we can determine how the information is formatted, how it needs to be formatted. So we'll need to understand, if the information comes in a PDF or maybe an Excel, and then we need to evaluate, is a PDF or Excel sufficient for that data from an integrity perspective, as well as a transfer perspective. Lastly, the next step that we would need to work on is the method of transfer. It's how will we be transferring the data between systems in a secure fashion? So as we kind of mentioned, this paper is really focusing on what is that data, and then there would be more to follow for understanding the full data structure, that information itself, and then how we transport it. The end goal is a freely available API that can be adopted by all of us here, manufacturers, vendors, and any of our partners that we work with.
Fantastic call to action there, I think, just at the end. We've heard about how important this is from Becky. Juan has talked us through a consistent process flow to explain what it is that we're tracing through. Elena talked about the user stories, thinking from the different personas in that flow, what they needed to do. Kim told us why the senior managers are going to support us doing this stuff and the benefits that we're seeking from it. Fred has articulated why it should be modeled as a set of services. Judith told us about the set of identifiers that make up the chain of identity. And David then said how useful that is to IT solution providers to have standard service definitions to work to and to help the vendors of different solutions to connect to each other, and showed the examples that we've worked on, the first few. And John then made the case that we need standard APIs so that we can interoperate between different organizations with their different systems. And I'd like to invite Vishal to come on the call, show your face and come off mute if you could, and just put into words what you put on the chat there if you're willing.
I hope you can listen me. So first of all, many thanks to all of you for sharing this wonderful insight and the work you have done, and I really appreciate. I work for Bayer and also quite involved into the CGT topic, so I truly admire the work you're doing. I just have the question. I mean, I really understand that we have a data structure and we want to go more towards the standardization. There are a lot of good ideas, but I think one important point what David, the second last presenter, mentioned, that we'll have this sort of a service platform of COC and COI. Yeah? And unless this is sort of not, let's say, accepted by all the pharma companies, then hospital would have different interfaces, and then I think this whole idea of getting the data structure in the backend standardized will not be realized. So I'm kind of very keen to understand, how do you see this consensus being built? And I assume the BioPhorum is sort of a platform that will drive this topic.
So Vishal, I think it's an excellent point, and I think, as somebody mentioned, there's still a way to go before we get these standards in place. To my mind, the more that we can work on the data standards and the data structures, so things that Judith was talking around, things like what would be a standard for COID, then the easier it will be for these kind of all data transfers to go and for standards to come closer. And then I think the last point around APIs, so the more that we as an industry can focus on APIs and how you transfer those data, then I think it gives people more flexibility for existing solutions that are already up and running, or new solutions to come on, rather than necessarily trying to drive everybody to use the same software or the same backbone. You know, what a small company needs versus what a large company needs are going to be completely different. But I think, if my personal view, it's very personal to me, is if we were to focus on standardizing API structures and standardizing the data identifiers, then the more benefits we get to see sooner.
Thank you.
Maybe in addition to what Becky said, I would like to mention, I think from what I have seen is, before we even come to the point where we say, how do we approach COI, COC service by a particular solution, we really need to define what and that's the services approach we have taken, what is standing behind it. So I think, let alone a service definition for these COI, COC services, I think everybody in our industry calls it differently. Some of them say cell orchestration or patient orchestration or COI, COC tool or whatever. And I think the approach that we have taken can be seen as a first step to say, let's first define what do we actually need. And these different aspects over the journey, this is what we will need. So then hopefully this will make it easier for the solution providers like the COI, COC tools to say, yes, this is a service that we cover, and maybe we cover this to this extent or others to another extent. But I think this will really help to standardize the definition of requirements together with the regulatories, the manufacturers, and of course then the vendors.
And Chris Kane, I see that you have joined us on screen, and you're from Traxel, a leading provider in this area. How do you respond to this sort of question? Go ahead, Chris. No warning, by the way.
No. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you all. Yes, great topic today, and I think it's one of the things we're trying to strive to is making that data standard. And I completely agree with everyone's comments. Is that portal fatigue? Obviously, there's many cell orchestration, COI, COC provider, whatever we mentioned, whatever it's called, as Judith mentioned, what do we call that software? I think we're probably about 12 to 18 months away from having a standard COI standard at the moment, because again, we've got many customers who have very different standards and formats. But I think the collaboration which this forum does provide opportunity for makes hopefully expedite and accelerate the speed of these processes. And like I said, we're all got one goal here, and that's to provide the best possible service for our patients.
Fantastic. Paul, or sorry, Mosumi, Paul, could you come on screen just while the others are finishing this conversation so we can get you to ask your question? Somebody wanted to join in there. Do you want to just speak, whoever that was?
Yeah, hi there. This is Mosumi here. So can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Sure. So I really had two questions. One was, have you navigated this with the regulators or health authorities? Do we have any feedback on what they are wanting to see? That's my first question. And my second one is, I've also seen some variability, I guess, across the regions on health authority requirements or local regulations. And in some cases, I've seen, at least in Janssen, folks are following ISBT 128 requirements. I just wanted to navigate what are others doing, I guess, in the industry.
Judith, might you kick us off with interactions with regulators, health authorities, and so on, and standards bodies?
Yeah. So as you know, this publication is really currently in final development. So I think all of us are really looking forward to providing that to the complete industry, first of all, the regulators, and see how they react to that. So if this is something how they respond to that, and really use that as a possibility to really do a standardized discussion with the regulators. Of course, what we have done is that we have taken all of our conversations that we had previously with the regulators and really used that for the documentation. So everything that we heard or experienced as additional requests, or maybe outcome of a discussion where the regulatory said, well, something like COI-ID is not required when it comes to sample management. All of these results already flown into the document. And I also had the possibility to talk to someone from ICCBBI and discuss a few of the open questions that we had based on this publication. And this conversation also resulted in a few aspects of the publication. So I think I would see it's not approved or something. It's not that we say, yes, that's approved by the regulators of FDA, EMA, or whatever region we are talking about. I think we really hope for this document to be a provider, to say this is how we as the industry, as the manufacturers, sponsors, CMOs, solution providers, etc., see a possible best practice. And hopefully really this will give us a possibility to have deeper discussions with the regulators.
I see Fred wants to jump in as well because he's come off mute.
No, I just wanted to mention that there was another question on standards, and I mean, being ISBT 128 or FHIR, etc. Whenever we have standards, and we do not have that many of those, of course, I mean, they have to be followed, and that's something that has to be integrated and building on top of that. Thank you, David.
I was going to say, maybe because it's something you and I talked about, David, I think it was Vishal's question, right, is how do we get this to become a standard? So BioPhorum is I think you referred to it as a pre-standards organization. So our role isn't really to define the standard, it's really to collect all the different perspectives and say, we think we have the foundation for a standard, and then pass it off to a standards organization to use. So I just want to add that little bit at the end there.
Yes. But we want to gather people who are interested in doing that. So if that is you, then you can contact me, David Wallace, at biophorum.com or reply to any of the emails that gave you this invitation today, if that would be useful to you to participate.
I think in working through this, obviously we've had a diverse number of players in these discussions and putting this paper together, but I think the commonality of what all of us were experiencing, and the kind of lack of definitions, the areas where all of us were feeling pain, was very, very similar. So I think it'll be really helpful as people read this for us to kind of gain some momentum around this, particularly with regulators, with standards bodies, to try and drive this forward. Because if we can crack it, that's how we start to industrialize, speed up, reduce the costs of cell and gene therapy, which is what we're all after for patients, because there's such promise to it. But if we can't crack these problems, it's not going to hit the scale that all of us hope it will.
I just in 1 minute want to say our plan as a team for IT for cell and gene therapy. Actually, Tim Horton is now the facilitator leading this. His email address is at the bottom here. If you want to get in touch with either of us to join in some way, that's fine. We're publishing and promoting this stuff in a number of ways. We're doing this kind of in-depth pre-standard stuff. We're addressing some key topics, and just in the chat we were talking about some of that. Integration between organizations stuff, that's one of our strategic programs, along with others like MES of the Future and data architecture. And so, you know, all of this that we are doing is so that more people understand the distinct challenges that are going on here, so that by sharing what we're doing, we can accelerate our own analysis, design and build. We get better innovations. We reduce the risk, not just in the system risk, but also what Becky said right at the beginning. If we all have different systems, that's more complex for the users. That's risk to the patients. We've got to get that down. And if we get the alignment between the industry players, that is going to make it better for creating and developing new partnerships. And we want to see those standards adopted.
Whenever I see these services or standards, I have to assume that a great many of players in the ecosystem are going to implement these. And one of the things that we also need to make sure as an industry is, how do we establish then trust between these services, so that I can trust that you are delivering what you want to deliver and what you promised me to deliver, and on the other hand, that, for example, such a COI-COX service is doing what I expect it to do, and how can we do that in a way that allows for automation. Yeah.
Okay.
So
yeah, I think there's two answers there, right? One is at the high level of, you know, just through standard, you know, vendor audits, right? Are we doing what we say we're doing when we talk about system and solution development, right? The second is just, as we would expect with patient safety, is, you know, very thorough testing. So I don't think there's anything we can do to say, you know, hey, this trust is automatically going to be there. It's more about going through your processes and proving that you've done what you said you're going to do.
Yeah. From my point of view, it would be interesting to also think about, okay, how can we, so that basically is an end-to-end problem. So N player need to validate M players, other players. And it would be interesting to have standards and a validation by a third party or whomever, so that not all of us have to do that.
That's a good point. Is can we be like certified on some level by some third party to say, I've done a lot of that due diligence for you. Now it's, you know, almost like a COTS. I sign up for, you know, software as a service, right? Is I'm good to go. You know, we have the agreement. Now let's start to populate that data. That's a very good point.
Thanks. And this is not just for cell and gene therapies. The DISCO program was talking just last week. This is an N² problem for them, just for developing biologics and so on, if you're working with multiple CDMOs. And so they also came up with that same suggestion. And Krishna, your comment was really about validation. Maybe you've got the answer, but do you want to just speak a little bit about that, because it seems related?
Sure. So yeah, I'm just trying to just the magnitude of work that would involve, because this is so personalized. Typically for biologics, you have a process developed, and then, you know, you either do 3 runs or 3 or 4 consecutive runs, and you show your data, and that's typically how you validate your process. This is so personalized. So how do you, I mean, what are the challenges and how do you overcome them? Because, you know, everybody's different, their bodies react differently. So, you know, if in a generic terms, if that process can be just an overview of the process can be provided, I think it will help me better understand how you go about validation for these types of therapies.
I think from my point of view, I would say by following, for example, the standard that we are proposing, or say, of course, other standards, our aim would really be to say everything is already validated via computer system validation. So if we really think of the complete process digitally, and I know that there are also manufacturers and CDMOs who may have a hybrid system, right? Part of it is on paper, part of it is on computer. But no matter where we are, I think as long as we validate the connection and the interfaces between the different softwares that hand over this traceability aspect, I think that's exactly the advantage that we are looking for, to say if you have a validated process when it comes to the complete traceability, then we don't need to look into it for every individual patient. Then we already have the process in place that allows us to really manufacture, and over the different products, over the different projects in the pipeline, we have one ecosystem in place, and basically they are compliant with the CSV standards. We already see a lot of benefits. And one example in the ISPT 128 guideline, which I personally really liked, was that they said, well, this COI identifier would always be checked by a checksum. And if we have a manual transfer between 2 systems, because we don't have an API in place, for example, then the second, so the receiver system, would need to recalculate the checksum so we can do the recalculation. So they again provide some guidance on that, and I think that's extremely helpful, because with that, the solution providers can say, okay, that's what we will provide, and the manufacturers again know that will be sufficient as long as we are using the ISPT 128 guideline. So I think things like that are really helpful right now, and I feel that we are really getting somewhere.
Good. And since you're talking about ISPT 128, Karen has had to leave us, but her comment was that ISPT 128 examples are now prominent within the expanded HL7 FHIR biologically derived product resource in the recently released version R5. I haven't looked recently at FHIR. Does that resonate with the others on the call? Yeah, and it's helpful. Good. And just I wanted to get the final comment that I wanted to pick up on the recording. And this comment is about the need for doing chain of condition as well as chain of identity. Anybody got any comments or any work being done on that you're aware of? No?
That is something that I have been discussing quite a lot lately, and we feel that we actually don't have a standard on that yet. And also, if we think about the digital landscape for the different systems, it seems that actually the chain of condition is something that is not as explored as COI and COC yet. So I think it's definitely a really good comment that there is some need.
Yeah.
Becky,
so raising items that could be on our future agenda. So
yeah, I think it's a very fair point. I think there is also precedent though in terms of cold chain products. So where normally cold chain would be from the manufacturer through the whole distribution network, this adds an extra bit on at the front, but it's not. There are distinct parallels.
Good. So with that, I think we've covered most of the questions, and thank you guys for staying a little bit extra today. Let's say goodbye to everybody and look forward to the recording and the next time we actually meet up. All right. Cheers. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye. Bye.
Goodbye.